So, just to continue, yeah, I felt very badly treated by the particular judge for various reasons. I just felt because I wasn't, no, there was conflict of interest, certainly, and also because I wasn't representing the state naturally, was seen as, somebody who was, I wasn't, I was just looking for fairness for ordinary people, which, you'd imagine the state would be looking for. But I think the state has got too entitled, and the judiciary has got too entitled and too narcissistic, and not all of them, but there's a huge amount of it, and there's a huge amount of self-preservation. So the media seem to be controlled by the lawyers, and the same set of lawyers seem to be running the whole show. Some people see the banks are all there as well, but I really think the lawyers are running the whole show. So it's the system that I'm saying needs changing, and there's a lot of lawyers who'd make excellent arbitrators, and it would be excellent in an arbitration for a system, and then there's other lawyers who might be better as constitutional lawyers or maybe criminal lawyers or whatever like that, or serious criminal lawyers, etc. So there'll be always need for courts. So I'm just saying we need a new system of law which has arbitration, mandatory arbitration, for us to try and take the darkness that's covering the world at the moment, and I can't see that changing without a change in the justice system. So this is about 12 years in the making, in terms of how, looking at law, psychology, human rights, dispute resolution, philosophy, all of these things, and humanity, empathy, compassion, all those sort of things, looking at personality disorders, looking at trauma and all of these things, and trying to see, is there any first step where we could turn things around from this. Everybody's saying we're in a dictatorship, there's no democracy, it's all corruption and all the rest of it. So I really see the starting point here as the justice system, and the only solution that I can come up with, and I've looked all around the world for solutions, and there are arbitration models in some countries, but they're not well developed, and certainly none of them are very few are trauma informed. So this is a new vision because of all the elements that I examine, particularly psychology, conflict resolution, personality disorders, trauma, all that sort of thing, and the effect that life is having on people. I mean, the vast majority of people who are going out to work are finding it an awful strain and struggle, and they're stressed, and they're burnt out and stressed. So this trauma, and it comes out in different ways to different people, and this has to be recognised really. And there's the narcissism, the psychopathy, and the sociopathy, and the traits there are absolutely, and they're usually associated with very powerful positions in hierarchical institutions. So it's trying to bring that down, and to have a more cooperation and negotiation and dialogue and those sort of things, compromise, that sort of that's our part of the trauma-informed arbitration, where there's humanity, and trauma is understood rather than mocked at, and then but it's understood in many of the different dimensions in which it can present itself. So this would be fair to everybody, and there are people that are extremely controlling because they've had trauma in their earlier life of sort, and there are people then who are traumatized because of the effect of on them of this excessive control. So people say we're being controlled. So that would all result in us all being traumatized by all this control. So the only way I can see the control being brought down is if we have a system where control is not valued in the same way, compromise, negotiation, dialogue, all those things, conflict resolution, all those sort of things which I've studied, and psychology and trauma, and all those things are brought together in an arbitration system. So you need a lot of skills to be a trauma-informed arbitrator. So you probably need different skills. Not one person will have all those skills, very few would have all those skills or understanding. I'm kind of unique in that I kind of understand more, but a lot of people wouldn't have done as much research as I've done, or reading on all of this, or have the empathy skills. But empathy, valuing empathy, valuing compassion, and they're not, or kindness. These things are kind of mocked rather than, and these are really valuable skills because they're emotional intelligence and that. So we've got to move away from this cold, detached, black and white win or lose system, because it's creating a darkness in the world. And it's very clear to me that it's all this narcissism, all this sociopathic pathology that's taking over, and it's because the systems are encouraging it. And we need systems to discourage it, or to reduce it, or to try and minimise it or manage it in some way, and recognise it, even the harm that it does. And I think that can only happen in a trauma-informed arbitration system. So it isn't about blame, it's about trying to get a resolution and put a focus on solutions and conflict resolution rather than necessarily blaming, but being very aware of trauma and the dynamics of trauma in all its presentations. So that requires a lot of expertise, which is not in the court system at all, very clearly. So this is trying to do two things, which my judicial review is about. First of all, establishing in law that the Fine Gael block was unconstitutional, and that can only be determined by I suppose a court, and I suppose the Supreme Court is the court to do that, because they have the experts in the constitutional law. But very clearly to me, it's unconstitutional, just as a mathematician, because the counter examples say 12 at 1/6. 40, I think, and a couple more. So there's about 6 of them on which you could get a breach. You only need one for a counter example in mathematics, so we're focusing on 12, but 28. There's 1/6. There's about 5 of them really where you could cross out breach. So there's about 7 or 8 breaches, but you only need one to breach the Constitution. So it's a unique case. So I'm not sure all this case law that the other side brought in on the last. I think Francis Kieran, I think that was a huge amount of case law, but it wasn't on the money here. It was divergent case law. In mathematics to be considered divergent, it wasn't convergent. It wasn't even in the limit. It didn't come on the point at all. So the fact, is there any case law on this point? Our nearest point really is Taoiseach versus Crossley versus Taoiseach, and I certainly thought the other side brought up a pile of irrelevant case law to blind us with, or the judge with irrelevant case law. That was my opinion. And really, when you look at the block, there wasn't really anything like it previously in the history of the state. So any other case law is really divergent case law in a mathematical sense. It's not on the money, it's not on the point. So is there any case law on the point? And they brought in mountains of what were, in my opinion, divergent case law. And so in the mathematical sense, divergent. In other words, it was nowhere near convergent. There wasn't anything. I thought Crowley versus Taoiseach was probably the closest to it. But we see, not being the barristers, our side were gaslighted. We felt we had a much stronger case, but we were gaslighted because it didn't really suit the judiciary to have us around the week before the election. So we didn't plan it that way. We didn't plan that. We were presidential hopefuls, so we couldn't have taken the case any earlier. So because we were trying to. I was trying to avail of the Protective Disclosures Act to help us, but we couldn't go to the courts because that route had been closed down through the unfortunate amendment, which I believe is contrary to human rights, the EU Charter, the EU Directive, and many of the human rights that we should be aligned with to our association with Europe. Like, we can't pick and choose, but it is, in my opinion, the current Protective Disclosures Act, which has now been discussed, finally, the people are coming out speaking about how poor it is. It is a huge dilution of EU human rights legislation, which we've signed up to. It would fail on several of the human rights laws that are currently there if we brought it to Europe. Anyone known as brought the protective disclosures act to Europe. So, but of course, if we were to use the thinking of the current justice, we would tidy it up, we would sort it out. And this is what I tried to do when I brought the disclosure to Pascal O'Donoghue and subsequently to Michael McGrath. I was hoping to tidy it up in a way that the current Chief Justice, does. He tries to get politicians to kind of tidy their act up before he kind of rubber stamps a Supreme Court. So I was trying to get them to do the same thing, but of course, not being the Chief Justice, they weren't going to tidy it up for me. Instead, they've ruined the protection. They've absolutely destroyed the protection, and they have put in penalties and penalisation and cruelty and gaslighting of every sort into the act, and it seemed to be. I mean, maybe it's personal, but I've taken it as an insult to my research, which was trying to actually tidy up, trying to get them to tidy up their act in the way the current Chief Justice does. Apparently, he tries to get the politicians to tidy up their act before he delivers the judgment, so he gives them a chance. So I was trying to do that, but of course, not being the Chief Justice, I was ignored and I was gaslighted. But it's the impact on other, when I looked at the new act, because I'd been doing a lot of other stuff, so I didn't look at the new act until really the president. I was absolutely shocked at what was done to us in the amendment, and the Transparency Ireland were there, and they hadn't communicated with me, and I had given them my paper, and several other people had my paper on the protective disclosures. Loads of solicitors had it, and were using it, and but they, like, the way people take your ideas and then they give you no acknowledgement, and they make money out of your research, and you get no acknowledgement. Well, I'm getting acknowledgement now because of my my ranking worldwide in terms of global reach and things like that. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinarily high. It was 1-2% there last week. And so it's really hurtful that all these people would be using our legislation. None of them would. Research, none of them would tell you, and they're all making a fortune. But they're not making a fortune because whistleblowers are being destroyed by this new legislation, which is in design, has been designed to maximise the torture or cruelty or penalisation of anyone who and they're just sent from one circle, one institute, and nobody will be accountable. They'll use gatekeeping, they'll use all kinds of blocking. And blocking is a good word. Everything is blocked, or it's we don't have the authority to do this or that, and there's no accountability. There's no. It's an appalling act, and it would fall so far below you used to have it as a fail. It would be an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment of an act in terms of human rights or any kind of whistleblowing act. So this is trying to do what I tried to originally do. In other words, where we are now, trying to get the Supreme Court to fix all the flaws in the Protection of Disclosures Act, so it is EU compliant. So it's trying to do what I was trying to do. Now, the judge, the original politicians didn't do that. They did the opposite to what the Supreme Court, Justice O'Donnell likes them to do, to tidy up. They did the opposite. So this is an opportunity now for Justice O'Donnell to get the politicians to tidy up the Protective Disclosures Act. By tidying up, I mean bringing it up to EU standards. So that will require a huge amount of work. Now, in my research, I have suggested many ways in which they can tidy it up, but I would like to bring trauma-informed arbitration into this as well, because of whistleblowers are so traumatised by the whistleblowing. It's a very traumatising experience, and the act itself, any kind of whistleblowing is going to be traumatising, but particularly if the act is designed to traumatise. So something had to be done about all the whistleblowers who have been duped by this incredibly flawed act, including, I'm incredibly duped because it's incredibly traumatising to know that, the result of me trying to get the politicians to tidy up their act and to get but you see, it exposed so much wrongdoing, and it retrofitted illegality onto legality, or the other way around. That is absolutely stunning, astonishing. But I think there's nothing we can do about that. The best we can hope for here is to get um, is to get the Supreme Court to bring it up, and if they introduce a trauma element to this, then in my mind that might be some restorative justice for what they did to whistleblowers in the in the dilution, in the massive dilution. It was one of the most regressive amendment acts ever in the history of the state. That's how bad it was. But there is an opportunity now for the Supreme Court to take this seriously. Now, I have no faith in the O'Donnells because they've been targeting me for years with narcissistic projection or whatever, or grudges. That's all. It's grudges. This is how I feel. They've ganged up against me, and I believe they've been behind a lot of judgments in a few cases that I've been in, and they've let me down big time, and I'm asking now for restorative justice from the O'Donnells. So we'll see, but not necessarily for all the Irish people. So I'm mentioning in particular because they're major players in the Irish legal business. So obviously it's the Chief Justice that will be the person here that mostly has to make the decisions. But I mean, I think he has a duty here to do the right thing. And he can decide to gaslight and to write scripted judgments allegedly, and or he can change his ways, and he can decide, well, we really need to fix this act because the politicians are already jumping up and down complaining. We heard today about a TUSLA destroyed. We have heard so many whistleblowers destroyed. Now that's because the act is currently so weak that it's actually punishing and penalising and traumatising and re-traumatising whistleblowers, and so that's why I think we need the trauma element and trauma arbitration in it, if we can at all help to resolve some of the conflicts that arise out of protective disclosures, and there are probably others that can't, but I still think it's worth a shot. But of course we're looking for trauma-informed arbitration with family law as well. I mean, we've got a commercial arbitration act currently going through the Dublin standard, and yet why haven't any of the family law people coming out for a family law arbitration act? I mean, that's shocking given the impact on families of the lack of it, and I mean it's shameful. It's shameful human rights, in my opinion. The family law is one of the most areas where the human rights are most abused, in my opinion, particularly in many cases women and minorities. So this is looking at a number of things. It's trying to get the bloc established, declared unconstitutional, so that it can't happen again, because it's an interference with Article 12, with our democracy and separation of powers, and it's kind of proved it statistically. One of my papers was one of the number of papers that are on academia.iu. There's a lot of them there, because I've looked at it. I look at it in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of angles in which you can attack this horrible, this disgusting dilution, and then these are all issues which are raised here. Initially, this is just an initial submission, but it's very clear what the points are. But what we're looking out of this is we're looking at tidying up the act, and tidying up the act doesn't mean it means grossly improving it. So it's up to the judiciary. If they're going to gaslight this and waste our time, they're wasting the time of the Irish people, and they're going to commit so many whistleblowers to torture, and really they'll be at fault, because they've got to sort this out, because the politicians refused to, because the politicians did not sort this out clearly. And if any of the judiciary were involved in this, well, they've got to realise that they're no longer working for the executive. They're working for the people through the separation of powers. So they've got to change their thinking, and they'll have a while to understand they are not working for the government anymore. They're working for the people through the separation of powers in a separate division of the common law. So this is something that that seems to be a problematic. This deference to the executive, overly deference to the executive. Now there's deference to the executive giving the chance, but there's not doing it everything their way. And favours for favours for favours. I mean, that's got to go out the window, and that's just corruption. Favours for favours for favours. That's perceived to be corruption, and that's not good enough. So this is what we're looking for here. I mean, it's it's a very complex document, but the major angles are the block, and there's other issues, around the SIPO standards and things like that. They're kind of administrative, but when you take all the administratives together, they also amount to constitutional blocks, which is your constitutional breaches. So they're there as well, and then there's the protective disclosures we're seeing is a miscarriage of justice as a result of the block, and other you can rely on other aspects of them really would dilute the block to say that the block protective disclosures, and then the protective disclosures themselves are considerably EU compliant and they're anti-human rights. So we want all those to be fixed. So this is what this is about now. It's about getting the Supreme Court to do a bit of work for a change. I mean, some of the cases they take on now are, they're nothing in comparison to this, and I think they're going to gaslight this, and this requires work from now I'm a workaholic, and what am I paid compared to them? And I've done all the work for them. They're very to do only read my papers. They read my papers and they've got the answers, and I've got all the work done for them. So they've just got to read my papers, and they can just decide to agree with them or not, but at least they'll have a blueprint, and they can improve it if they want. If they can improve it and make it better, I'd be delighted. But certainly, they won't get anyone better than me to offer solutions. So this is what I'm asking from rather than ranting and raving at the O'Donnells and others that have really crucified me for years because of my intellect and so on, and my extraordinary brain, and I suppose it's a threat to a lot of people, but I'm not like that. I don't view people in an up and down way. I look straight across at everyone is on the same level. Everyone has their strengths and talents. So I'm not a DIY person. I'm brilliant on interior design, but not on I can't. I'm not good at changing light bulbs and things like that, fixing computers, that kind of technology. So these are the questions. So let's be very serious here. We're looking for here serious analysis and critiques and work from the Supreme Court to sort out a lot of problems and to take their role as separation of powers seriously. And we've seen cases recently around the world where judges have resigned because there has been undue interference with separation of powers, and they have taken that very seriously. So judges won't resign here, but what they can do is strengthen the separation of powers by making sure that this is properly examined. So by working on this and getting it properly sorted in the way that I wanted through the political system, which failed clearly, which made it a generous mistake, what they can do now is use the opportunity to show the power of separation of powers by putting their stamp on this and saying that what was done to the Protective Disclosures Act by the executive was unacceptable, and what was done by the bloc was unacceptable on behalf of the people. So that's looking at it much more in terms of, now I would like a trauma-informed protective disclosures and a lot of other things, as if you read my paper. So I have a lot of solutions to a lot of our global problems here on my work, because I've been thinking about it for a long time, and they wouldn't get a thinker as strategic or as multidisciplinary as myself. So there's a lot of stuff that I've written that's on academic that could be very useful to the Supreme Court if they wanted to read it. I mean, that's up to them. But this is the that's just research. So this is the main part. And I mean, I can't put 100 papers in, or 50 papers or whatever I've written over the last while. I can't put those in. But each of them are very deep, and they are really addressing global problems, and these apply to Ireland as well. So that's where I am now, trying to sort out very serious global problems. It's quite painful, because I see the darkness in the world, and I see the dire need for sensible change. And where I see the first step is the justice system, and this is just a start here trying to get this sorted. So perhaps there's a lot the Supreme Court could do here if they looked at my research, and they could do a great job rather than just gaslighting it like what it was done before, allegedly. And I really would appeal to them now to take me a lot more seriously than I was taken by the previous judge. They're not dealing with a lightweight here. I'm a real heavyweight intellect, and this should be taken extremely seriously, because this took years to come to fruition, years and years, and it's so many disciplines got into this, and my work is so multidisciplinary that it has everything in it, really. So this is why I think we need to perhaps take a step back, and I want to take a step back from all this video, because it's too intense and it's too difficult for one person. And I'd like to ask people, I'm trying to set up a GoFundMe, like Mr. Byrne as well, because it's very expensive, and it takes a lot of, it's not just courage, you need a lot of courage, but you need a huge intellect to take on the likes of, the Supreme Court. You need a massive intellect. I mean, I'll have to take on the intellect of the whole lot of them together. And my work already would stand up to the whatever work they've done. But I wouldn't be as legally trained there. Like footnotes and all that. But it's about making law accessible, making justice accessible, and therefore I write in very plain language. And it's the same thing, but it's in plain language, but it doesn't dilute. It makes it more accessible. So it's clear, it's rigorous, it's analytical, and it's in no way a dilution. It's just it takes away the nonsense, if you like, or the nonsense out of what you can get in a lot of legal stuff, and in any other kind of discipline. You can get an awful lot of stuff that's not relevant, and it's divergent,